story of our divestment, which has been a very interesting story to tell. We have two very distinguished journalists with us here today who bring outstanding experience in politics, policy, science, economics, both internationally and domestically, and they have stellar careers before they started writing about the environment. They brought all of that skills, all that experience, all that perspective now to telling the story of the environmental movement and what's going on with climate change across the world. So I want to start by introducing Bob Deans, who is the Director of Strategic Engagement for the Natural Resources Defense Council. He started his newspaper career, and I guess you are a newspaper man, right? You're not an all-media journalist?
That's correct.
He started his newspaper career in Charleston, South Carolina. He moved to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and then became an international and national correspondent, writer for Cox Media. So he's written for our local Dayton Daily News, some of his work. He was president of the White House Correspondents Association in 2002 and 2003, which must have been a fascinating time to be doing that. And in 2009, he took his position with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And since then, he has co-authored several books that are putting the environmental issue in a bigger context and advancing the national conversation on climate change and the environment. So I've asked him to talk a little bit about a topic that has come up here in a number of workshops, which is how do we talk to some of our internal audiences? How do we talk to the people who are our alumni or our donors or the people who have supported us and have those difficult conversations when they may not understand some of these decisions? Bob?
Thank you so much, Cilla, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me. Suzanne and I were both talking about what an honor it is to be with people like you who are really at the forefront of this movement, who are really making the hard decisions and sometimes making the hard arguments to your own people about why it's important to align our resources with our values and our goals, and that's what this is really all about. And so I started out in the newspaper business when I was actually 10 years old, delivering my hometown paper, the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I fell in love with newspapers. I came to believe that newspapers were the last line of defense between the forward march of civilization and a backward devolution into anarchy. And as newspapers are crumbling all around us, I've yet to be disproved. But in any event, I didn't leave journalism. Journalism left me. Fortunately, somebody was willing to pick me up, the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is the gold standard, we believe, for environmental advocacy in this country. And briefly, what the NRDC does are three things. We tell the truth about what's happening to the environment. We have something like 150 scientists in our organization. We stand up for the policy solutions that we need. We have policy experts that we hire from the Hill and other places. And finally, we use our laws and our courts to hold polluters to account. We have a lot of attorneys. We understand the importance of that. And that's what we do at the NRDC. It's all we do. We've been doing it for 45 years. We like to think that we're getting the hang of it, but we try to do it a little bit better every single day. My role as Director of Strategic Engagement is to try to think in terms of how we talk to the public about what it is that we do. And as Cilla was saying, there are different audiences. The very first thing we have to know before we start talking is who is our audience. Because one thing that I've learned in 30 years of journalism and advocacy journalism is that what I say and write really doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what you hear, what you understand, and what you believe. If you can't hear what I'm saying, if you can't understand what I'm saying, if you don't believe what I'm saying, my efforts are roadkill. But if you do hear, if you do understand, if you do believe, then we have the power to change, to create a better, brighter, more hopeful future for our children. And that's what we're all about at the NRDC, so that's what we try to do. So when we talk to an audience, the first thing we need to know, what are they going to listen to? They're going to listen to what they care about. So we try to talk about what matters to people, kitchen table issues, what matters to our children, what matters to our future, what matters to our health, what matters in our own environmental backyards. The next thing is, how are they going to understand? What language do we use? We have scientists, we have PhDs at the NRDC, but we understand that talking PhD to PhD is not the same as talking to the public. And the final thing is what are we going to tell them? What message? What are they going to believe? Who do they trust? Who do we trust? And so we try and think about that in terms of our messages and our messengers. I think when it comes to divestment, and we're both very much looking forward to your questions, but just to kind of open it up, we try to think about divestment in terms of what it is and what it isn't. Our youngest child is in her second year of college. She's down in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, so I hope you guys won't shed too many tears for her. But anyway, I told her, like I told our other two children, this is about investing in yourself. And you'll invest in yourself your whole life, but there's probably never going to be a time like your 4 years at college when you can exclusively invest in yourself. She said, well, Dad, what does that mean? And I said, it is about aligning your resources with your values and your goals. That's what investment is all about. Divestment is when we reassess our investments and bring them back into alignment with our values and our goals. And so if we believe we have a problem with climate change, and our values tell us we have an obligation to protect future generations from the growing dangers of rising seas, withering droughts, blistering heat, raging wildfires, floods, and storms, if we believe that, if that's part of our values, that's part of our goals, then let's bring our resources in alignment with that. That's what divestment is. Here's what it is not. We are not going to bankrupt the fossil fuel industry by divesting. And that's the first argument against divestment that you hear. This is a drop in the bucket. You know, this is a global industry with $6 or $7 or $8 trillion in revenue every year, not assets, annual revenue. We're not going to break them. We're not going to bankrupt them. That's true. And it is completely beside the point. In the apartheid movement in South Africa, the stock prices of Texaco and the other companies that people divested from because of their South African interests were not affected in the least. The financial markets gave it a big yawn and a big shrug. Historically, however, it made a difference, and here's why. It cast a very powerful vote of no confidence in the apartheid system. It reflected values in a way that made the proponents of apartheid pay a price every day in the court of public opinion for trying to sustain the unsustainable. Now, what are we trying to do here? The exact same thing. We hear all the time about the free market, the glories of the free market, but here's the thing. A market is about three things. It's about value, it's about confidence, it's about expectations. And when we divest in our faith-based groups, in our nonprofits, in our foundations, in our pension funds, and in our universities, we are casting a vote of no confidence in the dirty fossil fuels of the past, and we are making those resources available for the clean energy investments of the future. That's important. We are putting a value on our obligation to protect future generations from the growing dangers of climate change. And we are changing expectations because we are saying this. We are saying no free people anywhere are ever stuck with a bad habit that does more harm than good. Our addiction to fossil fuels is doing more harm than good. We inherited that past, but we create our future. And when we disinvest, we are saying our expectation is that we are going to do better. We're going to do better by our children. We're going to do better by the future of the planet. We're going to do better by the clean energy systems that we know can mean real prosperity for our people. And where you see growth, where you see potential, where you see prosperity, that's where we need to invest. And that's what aligning our resources with our values and our goals is all about. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Suzanne Goldenberg is the U.S. environment reporter for The Guardian, which is a worldwide news outlet that perhaps you're not familiar with it, but it has staked out a leadership position both in its coverage of the environment and climate change and in its advocacy. I believe The Guardian has divested its resources, has it not?
We've started the process.
You know,
Yeah.
Suzanne comes to us with just a spectacular record as a journalist. She's been a war correspondent, a political reporter, and she's covered wars in the Middle East, U.S. presidential races. She's covered things from Alaska to Florida, from hurricanes to nuclear accidents to the Deepwater Horizon. And in reading a lot of her coverage, I think she covers the environment like it is a war. And she goes out to the front lines and she tells us what the stories are going on in the front lines. She's continued to travel around the world. She's authored books. She's authored a book on Hillary Clinton and produced a documentary on Yasser Arafat. And after our talk here, I encourage you to start bookmarking The Guardian and read her coverage of the environment, which is really terrific. So I'm delighted to introduce Suzanne Goldenberg.
Thanks so much, Cilla, and thank you all for being here. This is a great event. I'm sorry I couldn't be here with you earlier in the day. We were sort of diverted by the other great event that happened today, and I think that's the President's rejection of Keystone, which we knew was coming, but still comes down as a big surprise and really a significant moment. So it's great to be here with you all on this day of all days. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about what The Guardian has done in its response to climate change, which I think sets it apart from other organizations. I don't know if you noticed, but NPR has sort of rolled out a big new package of reporting on climate change in the run-up to the Paris climate negotiations. And the headline on this package is, "Does climate change matter?" Well, at The Guardian, we decided many years ago that climate change does indeed matter. Now, if you're not familiar with the paper, we started in 1821, and we came out of a sort of small L liberal tradition out of the city of Manchester. In the early 1960s, we moved our headquarters to London. People still think about it as a Manchester Guardian, but really in my lifetime, and certainly since I've been on the paper, it's been in London. But we've expanded digitally, or because of the digital revolution, we've expanded around the world. We have a large and growing operation in New York, and we have a big operation in Australia. So we now see ourselves as, born in Britain, but with global reach. And our aim was at one point to be the sort of liberal voice of the English-speaking world. And that's the perspective that we come from. So, for a number, I first started reporting on the environment in 2009. And what happened then was, that in late 2008, the elections were coming to a close. I had a great run covering the sort of Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama contest for the Democratic leadership, and then this historic race for the presidency. And I kind of knew that I was going to end on a high on election day in 2008. So about that time, The Guardian was thinking, well, let's expand our coverage of the environment because we think that this is something that's important for our readers. And for people who get The Guardian's value. So this was in 2008, which was, and as the sinking was going on, the sort of global recession happened. But The Guardian went ahead, created this new role, and put me in that job in early 2009. So I think at that point, the organization signaled its commitment to covering the environment. At that point, you had a team of reporters covering the environment and climate change in London. You had me here, and we had a dedicated environment correspondent in China. Those deployments have changed. Our guy in China has moved to Brazil to cover a range of options. We now have a new environment reporter in Brussels. But the point is that our commitment has been strong to covering the environment. We think it's an important issue, and we think it's an important issue for our readers. That said, around this time last year, the then editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, was contemplating stepping down after 20 years at The Guardian.
Don't want to make things worse. And then I think the other piece of it, Cilla, is that there is a positive story. People are seeing an opportunity here, and they are seeing the tide is turning, because in this country, in the first 9 months of this year, 56% of all the new electric generating capacity installed in this country was powered by the wind and sun. Think about that. 56% of all the new electric generating capacity in our country this year came from the wind and sun. That was not because of what environmentalists did. Those were cold business decisions, because suddenly wind and sun is competitive and in some cases favorable to fossil fuel production around the country. That's a big move. The Department of Energy tells us we can get 2/3 of our electricity from the wind and sun by 2050. That's not that far away. And right now, today, every single day, 250,000 Americans get up, suit up, roll up their sleeves, and go to work, helping us to get there. So when you see that kind of an opportunity to make real progress, combined with the fact that we have a visible, tangible problem that people can see by looking out their windows, that's where the whole idea, the whole construct for coverage has shifted.
Thanks. Bob, I think this is probably a question for you. So you talked about tailoring the message to an audience. And one of the audiences that is critical with respect to the decisions of the institutions that we work in or work with are the deciders, so the boards, the trustees. And with respect to decisions around divestment and investment in mission-aligned things, we're working with a group of people who have similar characteristics. They are older, they are conservative, they are white, by and large. So what would you recommend with respect to the messaging that we might develop and deploy to influence the thinking of that group of people, and they're mostly men, with respect to decisions around divestment and investment?
And tell me the institution.
Well, I mean, it could be any institution. I mean, it could be an institution of higher learning, it could be a foundation, it could be a nonprofit. But those are the sorts of institutions within with which we're working.
Great. I mean, the reason I ask is because I think you have to begin with the identity of your institution. Identity is pretty basic. Who am I? What do I do? And why does it matter? If I'm an institution of higher learning, I am trying to influence the next generation, the people whose ideas, the innovators we're going to be counting on to move us forward as a nation. I want my institution to be reflecting those highest ideals, and I want it to be reflecting what the students are themselves interested in. And so if I, Bob Deans, age 61, a white guy who grew up in the South, am on the board of a school in Cincinnati or Dayton, I really want to know, what do my students care about? What do my faculty care about? What is our mission? What is our goal? Not so much what are my sensibilities about, but what is our identity as an institution? And I think when you can align the disinvestment goals with your mission, you are on the soundest of footing. And you take that to your board, whoever they are, whatever their constitution, and say, this is our mission. Our mission is our purpose. It comes from our identity. It comes from who we are. This is the essence of what we're trying to accomplish. We have got to bring our resources in alignment with our purpose.
Hi. As journalists, I am wondering how you think the world of journalism in general should respond to the climate deniers, the people who insist there's no problem out there at all. Unfortunately, some of them are running for office.
Okay, so, this is something I'll be upfront, this is something I struggle with. I go through periods of hoping, well, if I just ignore them, maybe they'll go away. Well, obviously that's not going to happen. So, look, I can, I really have to cast my mind back. I have to say with, a fair degree of pride, we do not quote climate deniers. We just don't give them equal time, right? We haven't, I can't remember when we did give them equal time, right? And I think that is so critical. I think that's something that we see other news organizations moving towards. You've seen the Los Angeles Times saying, we're not going to, quote climate deniers. You see steps backwards because you see the Associated Press has said we're not going to use the term climate denier. But I think, so we're not going to give them equal time. And I think for me, what I try and do is when I talk about climate denial, what I've spent a lot of time over the years talking about the sources of climate denial, which means I've done a lot of reporting about the funding for climate denial and the front groups for climate denial, whether it's Exxon, whether it's the front groups set up by Edelman, whether it's the dark money from the Koch brothers and others. I've done a ton of reporting about that. So I think that's really important. This is not just some sort of organic thought process that comes on. It's a deliberate misinformation campaign. And I think one important thing to do is to continue reporting on that campaign because it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not all big oil, in my view. It's about, a lot of it is conservative ideology, and a lot of it is fear that for somehow if we act on climate change, that's a big stalking horse for government takeover of our lives. That is what many people believed, and that is, that's what's motivating some of the money out there. So it would be too simplistic to believe, oh, it's just big oil, because that's actually big electricity. Right now, it's big electricity that's funding a lot of this, and it's big conservatives. So that's one thing I think it's important to, not give equal time. There is no moral equivalent for that. If in some ways I think, climate denial is, personally, I think it's akin to hate speech because it is damaging to the public good. So not to give equal parity, to expose the sort of power structures. 3, for me, I see that, and I see this landscape sort of forming for the 2016 elections. I think that climate change stands a good chance of being a wedge issue in this election. That's certainly the way that Democrats and environmental campaign groups would like to position it as such. You see a clear-cut difference between Democrats and Republicans on this issue. For it's useful. Democratic operatives believe in sort of framing Republicans as anti-science and out of touch with reality if you say they deny climate change. But I think it's important to move the conversation again about climate denial. Because I think that side is going to move too. It's not about climate denial anymore. It's about blocking action on climate change. Because it's, you could say, because they can easily escape from that category by saying, well, I think the climate is changing, it's always changing. Or I think the climate is changing, but there is no human role. Or as you've heard John Boehner say, I am not a scientist. So I think it's important to call out people, not just as climate deniers, but for blocking action on climate change and sort of for blocking the kind of action that is needed to avoid a catastrophe in the future.
Hi, and thank you for being here. I'm a student at Xavier studying urban sustainability, and so we definitely hear a lot about the media's effect on the environment and people's opinions of it, and of course, with you talking about kind of like the story, how do you tell the story to get people to get interested in divestment in the audience? That's also very important. But with what I've been hearing today, my big question is with divestment. Just looking it up, it seems like it's definitely picking up traction, and I've gotten different messages from it about, definitely developed powers being the ones to kind of take the lead in this initiative of divestment. But thinking of my campus and other campuses, these are very diverse. Campuses are usually pretty diverse in population. So being that divestment is a mission for different institutions, To take it a step further, how do we make it something ingrained in the more like international presence in institutions, on campuses, instead of just, I mean, we could just get it done, but how do you actually make it have a lasting impact and make it, you know, be like a more of a under the skin movement, something that moves everyone?
I'll take a crack at it. I mean, I do think you go back to where we were, what is it that we do care about, and what is it that we're going to listen to and understand. And I think when you start looking at a diverse community, like you say, diverse socioeconomically or internationally, you see that there are certain groups of people, certain communities that are living on the front lines of this environmental degradation. And the fact is, we all pay a price for climate change, but some of us are bearing a greater burden. And there's just no question about it. If you look at the victims of Katrina in New Orleans, the people who were living in the lower ninth and in the lower areas in general, if you look at the victims in the Philippines, if you look at the victims in Bangladesh, if you look at the victims in Kenya, in Somalia, in the Sudan, you see that people on the front lines of this environmental degradation are paying an onerous price already. And Kofi Annan said several years ago, you're probably talking about 50 million people right now whose livelihoods, whose homes, whose health is threatened every day by this widening scourge. And so, we can sit back and say, well, this is a problem for the future, but no, it's happening right now to more than 50 million people around the world. We have to connect that. And if you're a Presbyterian, you say, well, there's no time like the present. If you're a Buddhist, you say there's no time but the present. And I think when it comes to speaking to the urgency of this and connecting that to divestment, there is no time but the present. We can't go back and reinvest from 5 years ago, but we can make decisions right now that are going to affect our future in perpetuity. And that's where you grab the urgency of this.
Hi, this is for Suzanne. My understanding about the 2% or 2 degrees number is it came from IPCC models that were linear models that were suspect in the first place as far as their original observations or lack thereof, and then being vetted through a process of governments and large multinationals also having a say in how the number came out. So 2%, I was glad to see that 1.5% was put up this morning in an earlier presentation. All that being said, so that's one issue, and I'm talking about for campaigns. Have you considered the campaign to cover over time? I think it would be highly valuable to look at. My other understanding is that where we are with commitments and action today, that where we're actually going to end up is at 6 degrees. And so that's a devastating gap that needs to be addressed, and we need to monitor it and be aware of where we all are with it. And the nation, especially with your plans for growth and where you are, you sound to me to be a great organization and publication to do that public service.
Well, thank you. I mean, I agree with you. Oh, well, I guess I would agree. Yeah, I agree with you. The 2-degree goal is an internationally agreed goal, right? And it's a political goal. And even if you take 2 degrees on its face value, it's a probability thing. It's not 2 degrees will all be safe. It's even at 2 degrees, many countries in developing world, many of the world and low island states are going to have horrific impacts. Life will be unlivable there. That's absolutely true. What we're going to see at Paris is an attempt to sort of bring back the 1.5 degree goal again. And that'll be interesting to see in the whole mechanics of the climate change process, what happens at Paris in terms not just of setting the goal, but of really, because we know that the goal we know that the results of Paris, and there will be something that is presented to us as a positive result. We know that the actions committed to at Paris will not in themselves give us this 2-degree world, right? They may, if things emerge as hoped, set us on a trajectory where we will eventually keep that hope alive of someday at a later point getting to the 2-degree goal. But I think I agree with you entirely. I think, I think the sort of landscape of covering climate change is about to change after Paris. I think you're going to see the things shift from these sort of big coming together of 192 countries every year to try and get this agreement to now having different work tracks working on different parts of the agreement, actually implementing the agreement, if you like, actually cutting the emissions, making sure you're monitoring those cuts, making sure that those emissions the cuts actually add up to the actions that we need to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, and making sure that for those countries that are really on the front lines, that something is done for them. So yes, I agree with you. I think that, on one level, we've been pushing now to sort of get an agreement at Paris to make people see that's important to move the economy out of fossil fuels, invest in clean energy economy. On the other hand, I think a big focus going forward is to be making sure that the process remains transparent and honest.
Good afternoon. This is Mark Orlowski with the Sustainable Endowments Institute. Follow up on the question about climate deniers. We haven't really talked much about divestment deniers. Obviously, there's people that are opposed to divestment, but there are those that you might classify as divestment deniers. This coming Tuesday, I know a far right-wing group called the National Association of Scholars is going to be releasing a report called Inside Divestment, the illiberal movement to turn a generation against fossil fuels. And I'm wondering, what's your advice on sort of how to respond to that? Because presumably some reporters somewhere will want to run with this and want to get quotes. And obviously, it's going to have a very specific, very sort of far right agenda. But what are your thoughts on sort of how to respond and how to frame a smart response that doesn't just keep this in the news cycle longer than it needs to be?
Both of us, or me, or do you want to?
I think demonizing an industry is a bad idea. And I don't, we at the NRDC, we try to, as I say, we tell the truth about what's going on, but we don't try to demonize an industry. And I'll give you an example. After the BP spill, we came out with the first book on the spill. The spill was in April. Our book was on Amazon for sale in September. But we had a whole chapter in there saying that the reason these guys are out there in the Gulf of Mexico is because every single day in this country we're using enough oil to fill the Empire State Building 3 times. That's a lot of oil. And so what we have to do is we have to rethink the kind of future that we want. So I don't think demonizing an industry is the way to go. I don't think talking about bankrupting an industry is the way to go. But I do think it's perfectly consistent with our values and our mission to say we're going to invest in a different kind of a future. And when you understand that Bloomberg, which is hardly a left-wing outfit, Bloomberg New Finance just came out with some numbers recently saying that between now and 2050, there's going to be $8 trillion in global investment in clean energy. It's a huge investment opportunity. Every single one of us who cares about our portfolios ought to be involved in that. We ought to be a part of it. And so that's a positive way to be talking about this. But there's no getting around this. And I just, we talk about the difference between 2 degrees and 6 degrees. We have to understand what that means. The difference between 2 degrees and 6 degrees means, New Orleans is part of the Gulf of Mexico at 6 degrees. Miami is Venice, and the Everglades are the Bay of Biscayne. I mean, this is the kind of option we're facing. We either do something about it or we don't. And so to sit back and say, boy, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. We can't afford to take a haircut from getting out of fossil fuels. It's not a future-oriented approach. And I think ultimately what we need to do is all of us in this room need to imagine a different kind of future. And at some point, we need to aspire to that kind of future. And we inherit our past, but we create our future. Divestment, aligning our investments with our values and our goals, is part of creating the kind of future that we want for our children.
Go ahead. I was just going to add one point. I looked at that report really quickly because I was wondering how we should treat it, because we've come out and, there's been other campaigns brewing against the divestment movement, financed by the Natural Gas Association. I don't know if you've seen the ads come out yet, or they're web ads, yeah, but So there is, this is sort of part of that, but one point that they make that I think is something that would be worth looking at is they make the point of that in many cases there is faux divestment. And I think that that's something has to be addressed head on, is that, you know, a lot of the sort of big celebrations about divestment decisions are about companies or trusts really getting out of coal or tar sands, and actually they're staying, their money is remains in oil and gas. And in many, and pulling the money out of coal is kind of a no-brainer, right? I mean, who's going to put, you know, if you look at the stock price. So I think, you know, transparency in that regard is really important. I think it's important to talk about, to acknowledge the difficulties, not just of divesting, but of finding vehicles to invest in. I mean, that was one thing, you know, when I talked to Rockefellers within the last few months about their sort of divest invest decisions, and they said it was very, very hard to carry out the invest part. So I think if people are transparent about that, you will inoculate yourself from attacks.
One more question?
I keep hearing divesting out of the fossil fuels. What about divesting out of the corporations that support fossil fuels, the corporations that make the equipment and do the transport? Because there are companies that are just dedicated to that. Where does that fall in the divestment issues?
Yeah, let me just start, because that's a very good question. It's very tricky. I mean, you know, what about the companies that make the pipe? What about companies that make the pumps, the drill bits? It's tied to the economy, and it is so, it's such a web of connection throughout the economy. It's virtually impossible to say, you know, our hands are completely clean, which is another reason that at the NRDC, we don't get out and try and say, you know, we're holier than thou, or, you know, we're more moral than the next guy, because somebody's connected to somebody who's cutting trees down in the southeast and turning them into pellets and sending them. So, you know, we have to be aware of that, but you have to start someplace. And, you know, there's a list of 200 fossil fuel companies, the biggest ones in the world, that people tend to go by. And so at the NRDC, I'll just tell you what our approach has been. We've had a long-standing policy of no direct investments in any fossil fuel companies. That's been forever. However, we did learn about 2 years ago that one of the funds that we don't have any control over, and which was a minuscule piece of our investments, did have a portion of its investment in fossil fuels, and we said, you know, we can't abide that. And so we worked with a firm on Wall Street to create a fossil fuel-free investment fund. But let me tell you something, it's not easy, and it's not going to be perfect. Sometimes you are confronted with a choice between progress and perfection. And at the NRDC, we believe progress has to win out every time.
So I want to link some of the things that our two speakers said. There's an opportunity coming up with the Paris conference, the Paris talks, those agreements, that all of you have stories to tell. You've got stories to tell about people who you know will be affected by climate change, or people who are on the front lines of it. You've got good stories to tell. So my challenge to you is figure out how to tell those stories and put those in front of the news media as the Paris talks are going on. That's a good opportunity for you. So I want to thank Suzanne, I want to thank Bob, and thank you all.
Thanks very much to our panel. We'll pick up again at